Now you're welcome back to the conversation, and today promises to be very interesting. But before we get into the business of the day, we have a few things to touch up on.
Yeah, definitely. We do wonder what the Mali junta is going to do with these sanctions coming from the ECOWAS. We know that there's been a lot of international pressure, of course, regional pressure for democratic transition in Mali. We also
do you think it will be enough to force them to call for early elections? Or
I doubt
they might try to write this down.
Definitely they will. I really doubt
it's definitely something we'll have to look at going forward on the conversation. We'll probably touch on that. We'll let the experts share their opinions on
Definitely. But apart from Mali, we also have situations going on in Sudan. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about the Prime Minister's resignation. That's Abdallah Hamdok. But now we have protests continuing in Sudan.
Even after his resignation. So we're wondering how long will this take? It's the United Nations has called for. The United Nations Security Council is going to have a special meeting on Wednesday to discuss the political situation in Sudan, and they've also offered to mediate. Let's hope that will lead to some type of impasse, because as we speak, since October last year, 62 demonstrators have died in Sudan.
You know, it comes to say the willpower of the people. Imagine even after 62 demonstrators died, we still have them coming up and demonstrating.
Because they want democracy. That's what they've been talking about. But let's get into the business of the day. The conversation today will be looking at two important events. One in the east of the continent, where the Ethiopian government has pardoned a number of high-profile political prisoners, including members of the rebel Tigray People's Liberation Front, in a bid to promote national dialogue after a brutal 14-month conflict in that country. The government said that the key to lasting unity is dialogue. The purpose of the amnesty is to pave the way for a lasting solution to Ethiopia's problems in a peaceful and non-violent way.
We will also be looking at and discussing South Africa's ruling party, that is the African National Congress, who celebrated its 110th anniversary last weekend amid deep divisions, graft allegations, and broad challenges that saw it perform dismally in local government elections last year. Now, joining us today on the conversation is Dr. Khannenje. He is the Director, International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Chidi Anselm Odinkalu, who is a Professor of Practice, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, United States of America. Gentlemen, welcome to the conversation.
Nice to have you both on the conversation. Now let's start with Ethiopia. The government on Friday announced it was pardoning a number of high-profile political prisoners, including members of the rebel Tigray People's Liberation Front, in a bid to promote national dialogue. One of those already freed is Amhara politician Eskinder Nega, one of several leading government opponents rounded up after deadly protests erupted in 2020. The surprise move comes amidst a lull in the brutal 14-month conflict in northern Tigray after a dramatic shift in battlefield fortunes at the end of last year saw government forces retake a string of key towns and the TPLF retreat to a stronghold in Tigray.
Why can't you fight for your own country? Ethiopia is the only country not colonized in the African continent. That means the wealth of our African knowledge, the pure wealth of our African knowledge, lies in Ethiopia. So saving Ethiopia, making sure that Ethiopia does not fall into the hands of colonization, is saving the African continent. Because if the last country gets colonized, we have lost everything. Our history is gone. We now have to search deeper. So now we've got it. It's in Ethiopia. So if you want the restoration of our cultures and the African ways of doing things, just come to Ethiopia. The time is a clear example. The rest of the continent uses the colonizers' time, and the young people don't know that across the continent. But Ethiopia still uses the correct African time, when the sun rises, the nature's time. So those are small things that we need to understand, why it's important for all of Africa to fight and help Ethiopia with a good fight.
All right, we still have a lot, Chidi and of course Hassan, who are going to dissect these issues. Now, we see the situations going on in Ethiopia that's been on for about 18 months. That is since November 2020. And now we have the release of some protesters, people who are against the Ethiopian government. Now, some scholars would say better late than never. What exactly is the significance of this amnesty? I'll start with you, Chidi. Chidi, can you hear me?
I do hear you.
All
I
right.
hope you hear me.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, better late than never. It all depends on whom you're listening to. The question is, why are we here? And how did we get here? It's quite clear that what we're dealing with in Ethiopia is a war that probably didn't have to be fought. This was a dispute over the political direction of the former ruling party, the EPRDF, which is a coalition, or which was a coalition, and a multi-ethnic coalition of parties. And at a point of transition to a new prime minister who, by the way, at that point had not gone through any elections. And the question was what his future electoral fortune was going to be, and therefore what the future political direction of that ruling coalition was going to be. And this dialogue could quite easily have taken place then. Right now, it's going to be a dialogue on the terms of the prime minister, because he's the person who is calling it, and he's the person who knows alone what this dialogue means. Does Ethiopia need dialogue? Absolutely, it does. On what terms is a totally different matter, though.
Okay, let's start with the amnesty. We're looking at the amnesty for those people, people who are against the government and they have been released. Do you see any significance?
I would quarrel with the expression people who are against the government. Quite honestly, this is the second time I've heard you say it. Because to begin with, that is the claim of the government. The second thing is that every one of those people is a citizen of Ethiopia, and amongst its powers, the government of Ethiopia under Prime Minister Abiy does not have powers to denationalize people who are actually Ethiopian. It's really its effort to claim a monopoly of patriotism that has brought us to where we are. And the conflict in Ethiopia doesn't just endanger Ethiopia, it endangers an entire region, probably the most fragile region on the continent. And that's, for me, why all of us who are African, and indeed beyond the continent, need to take it rather seriously. I cannot begin to think that anyone should be describing these people who have been in unjustified detention for this long as enemies of the government. Because that's the language the government has used, which is really deeply divisive.
Okay, I would like to bring in Dr. Khannenje here. The key to lasting unity is dialogue. Ethiopia will make any sacrifices towards this end. These were the words from the government. My question to you, Dr. Khannenje, is this. The Ethiopian government declared an amnesty, released a few political prisoners, and less than 24 hours later, Ethiopian Air Force jets bombed an internally displaced persons camp in Tigray. So how genuine is this amnesty?
This amnesty, or the purported amnesty, it is, I think, an appearance or an effort to appear magnanimous in relative victory that have been registered in recent weeks by the government managing to push back, TPLF from some of the areas that have been captured. However, this doesn't go far enough, in part because under this dialogue, or the so-called dialogue, the main protagonists, especially on the other side, the TPLF and OLA, are not actually going to be part of it. Now, in any peacemaking process, you have to engage the main parties. Now, if the main parties, or if one party is going to choose who to engage on the other side, then it's going to be problematic. Now, this dialogue also doesn't go far enough insofar as addressing the contentious issue that has actually brought us here today. And the long history of the northern aristocracy in Ethiopia has served a role of actually marginalizing certain ethnicities to the detriment of building a nation. Not to mention that the very Constitution of 1995 lays the seeds or the foundations for actually what some parties like TPLF or even OLA are demanding today, because the contradiction inherent in that Constitution provides for actually an avenue to succeed in case the federal member states are not happy with the union. And so, without addressing some of those fundamental, both constitutional, political, as well as historical issues, I think it's going to be difficult to think or to expect much out of this process. However, in the meantime, it can provide some breathing room perhaps for a ceasefire and for humanitarian access, especially to affected persons.
Okay, let's also look at this pardons now. You will note that it coincided with a mission to Ethiopia by U.S. envoy, that is Jeffrey Feltman. And just after that mission, which he was pushing for talks between the different political parties and, of course, the warring factions. Now, what role would you say the international body played in the granting of amnesty and, of course, resolving the conflicts going on in Ethiopia?
The granting of amnesty is a practical, political, rather pragmatic move, especially by Abiy Ahmed in response to increased international pressure, both by from the continent and from outside, as well as the United Nations, to actually move to some kind of a ceasefire, to move to some kind of long-term stability. And what we are seeing is actually piecemeal. However, it is positive because it provides room, perhaps, for the parties to start, discussing or a potential discussion with regard to negotiated settlement and perhaps a working of a new dispensation for Ethiopia. But in itself, it is not sufficient. Now, we cannot say this body that is being, of course, largely controlled by the center and, of course, under the Prime Minister, was responsible for actually what is happening. I think Ethiopia historically has been essentially a very centralized, police state. And so those decisions hardly come from consensus from majority of a group. A lot of times comes from very few people who are very well positioned and who are very strategic, especially in terms of the political and security apparatus in the country. And so I will not attribute that directly to the Commission. I think I'll attribute it to the recognition that Ethiopia needs to be able to make certain move that is going, of course, to rehabilitate it to some extent, in part because the increasing sanctions and pressure from the international community, and of course also efforts by the African Union as well as other players. And so to perhaps give credence to one commission that has been formed there, I think it will be to overstretch the relevance.
Okay, I would like to bring Chidi in here. A number of observers have said the Ethiopian government, with its Nobel Peace Prize winning Prime Minister, should act as the bigger person in this conflict because they control the air force, that they have superior military power, and there's also a blockade of the Tigrayan region by the Ethiopian central government. What would you suggest would be a way out of this crisis? Because the Tigrayans have crossed the Rubicon and they're calling for all-out secession. Do you think the Ethiopian central government will let the region go and become an independent state as a way to bring about this conflict to an end, or it's unimaginable?
Well, in a way, you've got to deal with the landscape that you've got at any point in time. And the reality is that right now, neither side or neither sides, depending on how you compute the sides in this conflict, has the capacity to impose its will and procure a military endgame to this situation. It's quite clear that the Patriotic Party controlled government at the center in Addis cannot rout the TPLF in Mekelle. And it doesn't have the political wherewithal, even if it could achieve that, to take control of Tigray. Now, similarly, the TPLF is unlikely to be in a position to militarily uproot the government in Addis Ababa and cannot impose its will there. Certainly, to be able to do that, it needs a coalition with other entities who seem reluctant at the moment, at least, to go into that kind of coalition. Now, so you get to the fundamentals. Ethiopia cannot sustain this campaign for too long. The economy is in tatters. The government cannot pay its way. It's printing money to be able to get basics done within the country. For how much longer is it going to be able to sustain that? The supply lines don't exist either for the TPLF in many ways. And Sudan, through whom we could do some business, is also in a crisis of its own. Eritrea, also, which is in cahoots with Addis Ababa, can't also sustain that for too long, again, for economic reasons. Now, so all the parties, it seems to me, have good reason at this particular time to get into dialogue. The question, however, the reality is that both Tigrinya and Amharinya don't have any words for compromise. And historically, Ethiopia has not had a great history of compromise in sorting out these issues. Whether they are going to discover that new skill, I think, is a new challenge.
As I rightly pointed out, the fact that the Oromo Liberation Front Army will not be in the national dialogue. Also, we know that the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front will also not be in that national dialogue. So, do we actually see a major dialogue? Where exactly is the dialogue going to?
Well,
Chidi.
The OLA isn't there, but one of the people they've released is Jawar Mohammed. And Jawar is a huge voice in amongst the Oromo. And now, whether that's going to lead to a softening of Oromo position is a different matter. There's a great deal of schism amongst the Oromo. The Oromo, of course, are being the biggest nationality, ethnic nationality in Ethiopia, about 35–36% of the population. You cannot do any dialogue without a significant population of the Oromo. Now, the Prime Minister is supposed to be part Oromo, part Amhara, and so he could claim that he brings the Oromo to the table. That obviously is disputed because the tendencies represented by Jawar Mohammed are very significant. The TPLF are not there. You may argue that the Tigrayans only represent about 6–7% of the population, but they represent the gem of the military power, the strategic power in Ethiopia. And without them, you've got a crisis. And I totally agree with Dr. Khannenje that without them at the table, this is going to be difficult. Even with getting them to the table is not going to be easy. The framework does not exist at the moment. Many of the internationals who are involved in this don't have a good line to the TPLF and to the TDF, that's the Tigray Defense Forces. Now, it seems to me that's the first thing. Before getting to dialogue, building the confidence to be able to get people to that point, I think, is what is needed. And at the moment, a lot of that is not happening.
Chidi, I know you're not in the mind of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, but when he did launch this operation against the TPLF, he described it as what was going to be a quick military operation. Now he's stuck there. Would you say it was a failure of judgment on his part to have started this in the first place?
PMRB is evangelical, and he seems to believe that he's got a direct line to God, or whoever God's emissaries are on earth. This thing was launched on the 3rd of November 2020, I believe, and by the 28th, he proclaimed Ethiopia prevails. Anyone who knew the situation could have told I told my Ethiopian friends that was beyond hubristic, prematurely, and that was putting it rather modestly. Now, I think there's also an outbreak of hubris at the latest advances that have been made by the Addis side with the help of the Turkish drones. And whether it is that or whether it is strategic retreat by the TPLF, this war is far from over. And, all sides are playing the hubristic game, to be perfectly honest with you, it seems to me, for propaganda purposes. But all sides, I also believe, do know that the fundamentals do not conduce to war without end. But the instincts the traditional instincts of the partisans in this conflict and the protagonists will suggest that fatigue has not yet set in. And until that sets in, I don't think that mediation and dialogue is going to have much success.
How much fatigue are we hoping for? Let's go to Dr. Hassan. Now, we know that aid workers have suspended work in the northwest Tigrayan sector, and we would know that Abiy Ahmed has vehemently talked about opposing aid agencies, particularly in that area. So what is the fate of the people in that area? Do we continue to have people die of hunger while we are still waiting for a national dialogue that seems to not really have any light?
I think that's the contradiction with the current, sentiments that are coming from Addis, because you cannot allow people to keep starving because you're still waiting on national dialogue, whose result or consequence is actually not determined, and based on the composition and the vision of it, I don't think it's going to be able to achieve much, especially since it's going to leave out engagement with the main protagonists. Now, I think it's also important to understand, like what Professor Chidi mentioned there, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has a very messianic view, rather disposition, especially when it comes to governance and how he sees his place in Ethiopia. And that sometimes can lead to a lot of naivete, which of course then informed, first of all, contributed to the outbreak of the war, which was framed as a law and order operation that was supposed to have taken about weeks. Which of course has ended up taking a year. And it's true, we are far from over because neither side possesses the military, economic, and technical competence or capacity to be able to overrun the other. But one thing that is, is emerging is that the conflict hasn't reached what we call a hurting stalemate yet, to the place where both parties can see that continued fighting or continued war is way too costly than actually a move in the direction of peace. The military calculations still haven't stopped, either by the TPLF or by the government. So even though this gesture of magnanimity from Abiy Ahmed may be lauded or laudable, the fundamentals and the critical aspects of what that's required for such an outreach have actually not been included in it. And that is why, unless, of course, there is consistent pressure, but also support, both from the continent as well as the international community, to ensure that parties move towards a place where they can actually start talking and negotiate and have a ceasefire and allow access, especially humanitarian, and at the very least, stop the kind of drone strikes we have seen, knowing that the government increasingly has been receiving, drones and military support, from Turkey, from China, and from other parts of, in the Gulf countries. The environment for a real peace and negotiation is not going to be there, much less dialogue, because you can't dialogue with people you hate or people you cannot recognize. And right now, the government doesn't recognize its opposition.
Now, just before we close our conversation on Ethiopia, I'd like to take Chidi up on this. You have a background in human rights. The United Nations Security Council, the highest decision-making body of the United Nations, is going to meet this Wednesday to discuss the situation in Ethiopia. At what point would it be enough for responsibility to protect, R2P, the global political commitment that was endorsed by the United Nations, to act as a means, a last resort to end conflicts? Because you just described a situation that is almost like a Mexican standoff. Both parties aren't willing to budge. When would one death be one too many for the United Nations to intervene? And are you expecting any breakthrough from this meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Wednesday to discuss the Ethiopian situation?
No, I'm not. That's a rather straightforward and easy one to answer. The United Nations has not even been able to muster a squeak at the of indignation at the expulsion of its officers, including the officer that actually backstopped the investigation into atrocities in the conflict. There were 7 of them who were expelled, and the UN has been largely missing on that issue. Within the Security Council, there is no basis for believing that the permanent 5 can have a consensus on this issue. China is almost certainly going to veto. I think Russia will probably veto. We can't even get a chair's statement on the issue. I don't think we are going to get anywhere. No.
Okay, no end in sight. Well, we keep our fingers crossed. All eyes are still on Ethiopia, open for a peaceful resolution of all conflict. We must thank you, Chidi Anselm Odinkalu, Professor of Practice at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, USA, for your thoughts on the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a fine place to go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll be analysing the African National Congress issues as it celebrates 110 years anniversary with Dr. Hassan Khannenje. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us here on The Conversation.
The national leader of the All Progressives Congress, APC, in Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, says he has informed President Muhammadu Buhari of his intention to contest the presidential election in 2023. He however declared that he has yet to inform Nigerians of his intention to succeed the president. Tinubu stated this on Monday while briefing State House correspondents after he met with President Buhari at the Aso Villa in Abuja. According to him, the president is a Democrat and therefore has not asked him to stop the pursuit of his ambition, which for him is lifelong. The APC leader and former governor of Lagos State stressed that he has the confidence, vision and capacity to build on the foundation laid by President Buhari to turn around the fortunes of the country.
Major political development there.
In Nigeria, that's
we're
a serious
next to
one.
break the news then on The Conversation.
Definitely, and we've had so many rumors of the national leader of the All Progressives Congress in Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, running for 2023. But now he has come out officially to say that he has informed the president, Muhammadu Buhari, of his intention to run for 2023 elections, which is a major limelight in Nigeria. We know that the All Progressives Congress has been running since 2015 when it took over from the PDP-led government that was Goodluck Jonathan, and it struck the whole world, seeing a sitting president leave a governance and, of course, allowing for a fresh party to come in.
And the person of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, former Lagos State governor, is the national leader of the party, is a juggernaut, and this has a widespread political implications. So you're watching News Central Television. News Central is going to analyze this in detail during the VSA
That's
at
Village Square
Africa at 7 p.m. today with Slyman Alede. So you don't want to miss that one. Okay, back to The Conversation. You're welcome back. You're still watching The Conversation here on News Central Television.
And of course, we talked about the ANC celebration. That's 110th anniversary of the ruling party in South Africa. Now, this party has been founded since 1912, and it's a party who has been founded on the struggles of apartheid. This party came into place to fight the white minority rule in South Africa. And we see President Cyril Ramaphosa talking about the party working to regain popular support in South Africa.
Now, the anniversary events held in Polokwane, northern Limpopo province, came days just after a state-backed judicial investigation revealed how some of the party's top officials had benefited from corruption. The ANC is also sharply divided between those backing Ramaphosa, who is also the president of the party, and those loyal to former President Jacob Zuma, who has been embroiled in corruption allegations since he left office in 2018.
Be forthright in recognizing and deal decisively with the reality that ANC structures are in a poor state themselves. Many of them are focused on internal organizational conflicts, factionalism, and furthering the self-interest of individual leaders, which results in the lack of service delivery to our people and the lack of addressing the aspirations of communities that they are meant to serve. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated our already precarious economic situation. In a short space of time, around 1.5 million people lost their jobs since the start of the pandemic, and the unemployment rate we now have is at its highest ever.
I will still have here with us Dr. Hassan Khannenje. Dr. Khannenje, last year's municipal elections, the ANC won 46% of the ballots cast nationally, down from 54% in the last municipal elections that were held 5 years ago. That was the worst post-apartheid result for the ANC. Now, looking ahead to general elections in 2024, the results portend badly for the African National Congress. What does the ANC need to do to arrest this slide?
The ANC has progressively been declining in popularity, especially among Black South Africans, since independence in 1994, and of course, since the end of apartheid. And this, in part, has been contributed by the increased corruption, scandals, incompetence, and just lack of opportunity to many Black South Africans in particular, who were seeing this era as an era where their dream for prosperity has been deferred, has been stolen by the elite of ANC. Now, one thing that ANC needs to do is to try and win back the confidence of Black South Africans especially. And number one, they need to be a little bit more intentional, especially in providing opportunity to Black South Africans. The Black Empowerment Program, to many South Africans, they think it did not go far enough. It is important to remember that while Black South Africans constitute 80% of the population, they also make up 50% of the poor and only control about less than 10% of the land. And so these issues are still, I think, troubling majority of South Africans. And of course, with the stagnation in economic growth in recent years, which have been complicated, of course, by the COVID pandemic, I think the situation is even worse. But however, it's important for us to remember that there are also other parties, more populist parties, that have emerged, that have been able to eat away from some of the ANC's traditional support. And this is not helped by the fact that there are continuing fissures and divisions at the higher echelons of the ANC political party. And as you rightly mentioned, you have one camp that is pulling on the side of Ramaphosa, then another side that is more loyal to the former President Jacob Zuma. Yeah. Of course, which is also historical based on the trouble that existed between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party, which of course right now majority of them actually are in the ANC.
Okay, well, looking at this now, we have the warring sides from those who support the former President Jacob Zuma and of course Ramaphosa. Now, what strategies do you think that Ramaphosa can adopt to convince an already skeptical South African public space? We know that Ramaphosa right now is the president of the ANC party. So what strategies can he adopt?
One thing it will be to listen to especially those small parties, but also to listen to young people who comprise the majority of South Africans, but to also acknowledge some of the challenges that ANC used to have at the beginning, and especially in the Zulu area. Remember, Jacob Zuma comes from the Zulu community, which is very numerous. And for much of this, the pre-independence time and after the release of Nelson Mandela, there was a lot of bad blood between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was Zulu dominated. And in fact, very few Zulus actually voted for the ANC in 1994. Of course, the situation changed when Jacob Zuma, who was seen as one of their own, assumed power within the ANC. But of course, with the fallout that we are seeing now, some of those ethnic cousins and divisions that had been hidden for a number of years are coming forth. And they are manifesting themselves through what we are seeing, like, for instance, the violence and riots that followed the sentencing of Jacob Zuma. Now, like in any country, especially in this part of the world, the economy is something very critical. And frankly, the ANC has not done very well. And so one of the strategies perhaps will be to put in place mechanisms in way that can be able to guarantee, or rather, Black South Africans, especially young ones, some jobs. But another one, which is contentious, and is contentious even within the African context, is the xenophobic attacks that South Africans have rather directed against other Africans from the continent. Now, this is also informed by the perception that other Africans have come to actually take jobs. Now, that immigration issue has to be addressed in a way that is going to be satisfying to a lot of South Africans who are now disgruntled by the own leadership of the ANC, who have seen them as having betrayed their vision and their hopes, and supported, for instance, the ability of foreigners to work in their country at their own expense. But also, I think they're going to need a different economic approach that encourages a lot of private investment, because the ongoing crisis and the chaos and the violence has actually discouraged a lot of potential investment in South Africa, both by South Africans as well as the international community. And I think that is something that must be done with urgency.
Dr. Khannenje, I'm happy you started your statement by talking about the ANC should listen to what ordinary South Africans want. Now, let's take a listen to reactions from South Africans as the ANC celebrates 110 years.
I mean, there's so much of corruption and there's nothing being 27 years down the line, they're still using apartheid as an excuse. It's not on. I mean, hopefully this is a totally wake-up call for them to get their house in order.
I don't see anyone really at the moment that can take over Cyril. I back Cyril.
I think people still have that thing for the ANC, you see. They brought us where we are now. So if they can fix their mistakes, the corruption, everything, I think he can still win, yeah. Or anyone in the ANC.
Now, Dr. Khannenje, like you brilliantly analysed in your earlier submission, South Africa's economic and social problems are very multi-layered. There's still underlying conditions of extreme social and economic inequalities. And the ANC has been in power since post-apartheid. Is it time for South Africans to look at other parties and, because they've been riding on that Dr. Nelson Mandela and apartheid power?
Yeah, the ANC is what they call the founding political party of the nation. And it's still by far the most popular party in South Africa, if compared to actually other parties. However, I think what may be done, or what will need to be done, of course, is that the people also listen to other parties. The challenge, though, is some of these parties are extremely populist, and some of their visions are not exactly practical. And they probably go against
extremist,
yes,
for lack of a better word. Yes.
Yeah, some of the parties are extremist on both sides. You have white minority parties that are extremist, and you have black majority parties, which of course are minorities still, they're extremist. And so both visions are actually not practical and are unacceptable, especially if you have to continue having a rainbow nation, of course, right now, which exists mostly in theory than in practice. And so I think what is going to be important is perhaps some of the moderate parties, and they're there, that might not be very popular, to be able for South Africans to look at them, not for the purpose of removing ANC, but for the purpose of holding ANC to account, so it can become a little bit more transparent, it can become more accountable to the voters and to citizens, and it can be able to improve its own way of working. The trouble with founding parties, especially on the continent, is to become complacent once they're sitting pretty and comfortable in power. And if there is no threat of them being removed, from power, it becomes a challenge for them to change unless they're forced to do that. And so I don't think the solution will be to remove the ANC, but to look at other parties in ways that can actually improve the ANC in the meantime. Because as things stand right now, it's probably the only single unifying party that is more national as opposed to a lot of other parties that seem to be more parochial, especially in orientation.
Okay, while the ANC struggles with its internal conflict, we know that, of course, the South African court has said that the former president, Jacob Zuma, should go back to jail after, of course, dismissed his medical parole. Now, do you feel that there will be another riot with Jacob Zuma going back to jail? And, of course, is the party ready for, or can they handle another riot going on in South Africa?
Consequences of that.
The question is not whether there will be another riot. The question is when that riot will begin. Now, perhaps the state apparatus are more prepared right now to handle it as opposed to the previous experience. But given the history of South Africa, and especially what I call the Zulu nationalism, those divisions are going to be witnessed, and the feelings are very deep. When it comes especially to the sense of persecution of Jacob Zuma. So we are still more than likely going to see protests and at the very worst, violence, but I think probably on a limited scale compared to the previous one, hoping that the government right now has prepared itself. And so one of the things that was never really addressed, especially when the Zulus followed Zuma into ANC, is the kind of division that had existed before. Remember, the Zulu nation is a very proud nation, but has always looked at themselves somehow as different. And the fact that they're now instrumental within the ANC, they feel they deserve a special place in it, in part also because of their numbers. And so to be denied that, of course, is a recipe for protests and chaos as what we're witnessing right now. Now, Jacob Zuma, I think what he has done legally is wrong. The trouble is, politically, how much are you willing to actually engage me in that direction? And the reason I'm asking this question is because we all know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was critical in, for instance, the National Party, the white-dominated National Party, handing over power, not because they were right, but because it was the practical way to do. So perhaps if there could be a form of leniency in which perhaps he may be pardoned or something like that, even though it may be sending a wrong message. But so did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that actually pardoned the entire population and for the crimes they committed for 360 years. I think that may be the more practical and perhaps peaceful way to go. Because at this rate, chances are there's still going to be violence, there's still going to be riots if this guy gets arrested.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khannenje. It's been an absolute pleasure having you join us on the conversation. We do appreciate your insights and candor on the subject matter.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been a very intriguing segment of the conversation today. We talked about the ongoing protests going on in Sudan. We also know of Mali ECOWAS raising more sanctions in Mali. And on the program, we shedded more light on the Ethiopia's planned national dialogue. And of course, we also talked about this 110th anniversary of South Africa's major party, that is the ANC. And in the middle, we told you of the breaking news, the reports we got of national, or rather the president,
the national leader
of the All Progressives Congress, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, declaring his intention formally to the president for 2023 elections in Nigeria.
Yeah, so watch out for Village Square Africa. They will be discussing this and projections towards the general elections in Nigeria in 2023. It's been an absolute pleasure doing this with you. I'm Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. Do join us again on Wednesday, 5 p.m. African time for another episode of The Conversation.